Um, Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm a real fan of Quality Matters, so it's an honor to be with you, and I look forward to our time together. Thanks for all the coordination that has gone into this, and I'm going to start right off by sharing my screen and getting right into the session. I'm going to ask if you can, James or Jim, if you could just give me a thumbs up if my full screen is showing right now.
Yep, we can see it.
And is it changing?
We are
Did it change?
seeing all of the slide decks.
Okay, that's why I wanted to ask. I have a little quirk I found where I have to kind of reshare. And how about now?
Yep, there we go.
And did it, let me see if it's going to change to two pictures.
Yep.
Okay,
working
perfect.
good. Yep.
All right, thank you. Well, you know the title, the topic of this keynote. I want to start off by paying homage to my longtime friend and colleague, Grant Wiggins. Grant and I worked together for 23 years. We wrote Understanding by Design and 7 other associated books in this series. Grant and I were close intellectual partners, and he was one of my best friends. Sadly, Grant passed away unexpectedly from a massive heart attack a few years ago. But I dedicate my continued work to Grant. Ideas I'm sharing with you are really the fruits of two folks working together with a lot of feedback from others. So I want to just honor my friend Grant. I also want to pay homage to and honor the notables in our field. Certainly Ralph Tyler and Robert Mager. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, and I want to pay tribute to these great intellects and people that have influenced, I think, all of us. So my topic is around the framework that Grant Wiggins and I developed called Understanding by Design. And although our time is short, I hope to make this an interesting session. I want to begin by putting forth what we call the big ideas of Understanding by Design, which is basically a curriculum instructional design framework. And then look at, pardon me, look at the 3 stages that we've outlined in our framework and some of the key ideas in each, and then leave you with some further resources should you be interested. Now, normally in virtual sessions like this, particularly if there's a longer time frame, I like to, we set up meeting rooms, people have a chance to interact and then pose questions in the chat, and we have Q&A. Because of the number of people participating today, we're not doing breakouts for the keynote, but there will be an option if you have questions. I think the follow-up session, one of the options is to have a Q&A time with me. So I look forward to that if you have such. However, during this session, I'm going to invite you to engage in 2 little thought exercises, if you will. And for both of those, I would invite you to enter responses in the chat box. So this is the active part of even a keynote address. So I'll introduce those shortly. So Understanding by Design is primarily a curriculum assessment planning framework that has implications for teaching. The 2 big ideas in this framework are contained in its title. Grant Wiggins and I contend that a modern education should ultimately prepare students to transfer their learning, to be able to take what they've learned and apply it to new situations. But you can't transfer something that you don't understand. If all you have is rote learning, all you can do is give back what was told you in the way it was told. But we contend that a modern education is preparing students to apply their learning and thus should be grounded in understanding. Now, to say that we want to prioritize and focus on teaching and assessing for understanding in no way is meant to suggest that we don't care about factual knowledge or basic skills can be picked up, on your own. No, these are foundational. Every discipline, every subject, every skill area has foundational knowledge and skills. And definitely we need to build off of that base. But once again, my contention is a modern education should see the basics as the floor, not the ceiling. Because we all know this. We're preparing students and trainees in workforce kinds of situations for a world that's increasingly complex, interconnected, rapidly changing, and in fact, unpredictable. And the pandemic that has gripped our country and the world the last 14 months was really not on very few radars 15 months ago. And it's a symbol of the fact that the world is not predictable. And we need to be able or create people who are flexible, adaptable, able to deal with unexpected opportunities and challenges. Second big idea in understanding by design is by design. And Grant Wiggins and I propose a 3-stage planning process for planning curriculum, designing training, etc. So that's what I want to share with you in this session. One of the ideas I like to put forth is that we contend that there are 3 interrelated but not identical types of learning goals. And these are depicted on the screen. On the upper left, there are goals that I refer to as acquisition goals, where we specify what we want students to know. And this is typically in the realm of declarative knowledge, facts, basic concepts, and what we want students to be able to do in the way of basic skills. Every subject we teach in K-12, every course in college, every training session that I'm aware of has knowledge and skill objectives. But we also have goals that I describe as understanding goals. These are around conceptually larger ideas. They're not facts, they're more than skills. They're, if you will, the understandings that allow you to make sense of facts and to apply skills in useful ways. And then we have transfer, which to me is what we should be aiming for in almost all situations. Equipping students such that they can apply their learning to something new, not just give back information. So these are interrelated goals, but not identical. The importance, I believe, in clarity about these kinds of goals or outcomes has to do with A, how we learn them, and B, what we look for as evidence of their achievement. How we teach for recollection is not identical to how we develop skill proficiencies. And my contention is how we teach for understanding and transfer and how we assess those things is similarly not identical to how we check to see if kids or students remember information. Now, I am of the age where when I was taking a curriculum course back in the day, our professor told us that when we frame behavioral objectives for courses or lessons, we were not to use the word understand. And the explanation was, the term is too ambiguous, it has no precise meaning, and you can't measure it. So we had to only include measurable objective terms and verbs. Well, with all due respect to my curriculum professor, Grant Wiggins and I have taken a different tack. Our contention is no, understanding is what we should strive for. It's what the best teachers always work toward. And therefore, we shouldn't avoid the term because it may be difficult to define. Let's try to operationally define it, and let's look for indicators of understanding that can serve us with assessment. And I'll get into this in a little more detail shortly. Some of you may be familiar with the name John Hattie, Hattie. Hattie is a New Zealander, spent his entire 30+ years of his career at university level researching, teaching, and learning. He's written a book that you may be familiar with called Visible Learning, where Hattie looked at a number of teaching techniques and identified or quantified, if you will, what he called their effect sizes. Now, some people have quibbled with his methodology. He's using meta-analysis to derive these effect size constructs. But nonetheless, my experience is the instructional techniques that he identifies as most effective are in line with other researchers who have done kind of different analyses. Anyway, I've gotten to know John, and 2 years ago, he sent me an article and he said, "You're going to like this, Jay, because it's resonant with your work with Grant Wiggins." Here is these are his words with my graphic. John said, "In all my years studying teaching and learning, I believe we can think about 3 levels of learning." John said there's surface level learning, typified by teacher presents material to a student, or student reads it in a textbook or reviews it online. But if they don't do anything with that knowledge or that, that information, if it's just coming in and they're passive, it's likely that it will simply remain on the surface. It may be sufficient for them to pass a unit test or a chapter test, but the learning is superficial and it doesn't last. Then Hattie says there's deep learning, which he defines as I do, learning with and for understanding. It's deeper, it's enduring. And finally, Hattie says the deepest learning is evident when students can transfer. So this is one of the leading researchers in our profession who's articulating essentially the points that Grant Wiggins and I have long championed in understanding by design. So let me look more closely at backward design, the 3 stages that we've outlined. This is not a new idea. This honors Tyler, honors Mager, and others. But this is how we've packaged it, and we found that it's been an effective planning process. 3 stages of planning or design. Identify desired results. Well, of course, anyone planning anything should have goals or outcomes in mind. But you'll see in a moment, if you don't already know, there are particular ways in which we ask people to think about the goals or desired results for learning. Stage 2 of backward design is, for me, in many ways at the heart of this planning process, because stage 2 asks us to think like assessors, not teachers, not instructors. Think like assessors. If these are the goals we're after or the results we seek, what evidence of learning, skill proficiency, and understanding do we need? And we think about the assessment evidence before we get too invested in planning the instructional activities, playing out individual lessons, choosing resources, deciding on sequence and time frame. All the particulars of discrete planning, lesson planning, etc., are in stage 3. But the logic of backward design is you need to be crystal clear about your goals, and recognizing that there are different types of goals, this impacts how we teach. Moreover, we need to be clear not only on what we want to teach or what we want students to learn, we need to be clear about the evidence that will show that they have learned those things. So, I mean, that's it in a nutshell. Not a new idea, but it's proven to be an effective planning process. Here, in essence, are the 3 essential questions that Ralph Tyler raised in his book. And notice the sequence. This is backward design. If anything, we're honoring Tyler in our construct. Now, my guess is some of you are looking at this and thinking, well, duh, well, how else would you plan? And that's been my experience. Most of my work is with K-12 educators, but I've worked with college, university, and community college folks as well. Some people find this natural such that they wonder why you even need to label it. My wife, by the way, is in the arts. And when Grant Wiggins and I were coming up with our ideas many years ago, when I showed her our idea for backward design, she looked at me like I was nuts. She said, well, duh. Doesn't everyone plan this way? What I came to learn were people in the performance-based areas, the arts, career technology type of training sessions, and in schools and high schools, extracurriculars, athletics and debate and drama, theater. Backward design is the norm because you're clear about your goals, which is authentic performance or creating a product, and you plan backward from that. And the evidence that you look for is a high quality product or a successful performance. And your teaching and your coaching is what you do in stage 3 to get there. So that's a long way of saying, for some of you, this is just what you've always done, I suspect. But I can also tell you from my own experience and from working with thousands of educators, this is not always the way people think or plan. Now, hopefully people are planning with goals or outcomes in mind. But what I see often is that the next phase of their planning following the goals are the things that they're going to do in their teaching. They're going to prepare their lecture notes. They're going to put together their PowerPoint presentation. They're going to think about the various learning activities to engage kids. Or they might just march through a textbook or a technical manual. And when I started teaching many years ago, that's how I taught. I had a vague idea of objectives, mostly dictated by the textbooks I was given as a teacher. And then I planned my lessons. And even as a beginning teacher, I felt there was value in just kind of getting out of the textbook, engaging kids in thinking, doing some, what at the time would be crude examples of cooperative learning and paired learning and so on. But this was before the days of the internet. And it was really hard coming up with rich, interesting teaching activities. I made up a lot that went beyond the textbook. So it was all well-intentioned. If you had told me I should think about my assessments before I planned my lessons, I would have told you, well, that's backward. How can you test kids on things that you hadn't taught? And how do you know what's appropriate to assess until you've taught it? And by the way, I started teaching in the 70s, and we wanted to be able to go with the flow and not be too tight on anything. So anyway, that was my story. But I have met teachers at all levels, including university, that kind of resonate with this approach. If this is your experience, or if this is the experience of people with whom you work, it's going to require a shift in their thinking and their planning to really use backward design appropriately. But my experience is it's a worthy shift and pays off, in my experience, better teaching, learning, and getting the right evidence for our important goals. In Understanding by Design, Grant Wiggins and I have a design template, a planning template, basically a graphic organizer, and it reflects the 3 stages of backward design, and it gets into the elements in each stage. I'm a fan of the template just because of my experience using graphic organizers with students. A good organizer rubs off. It's not only a physical template, it becomes a mental template. It's a way of thinking represented in a framework, in a construct. Now, I have met educators who say to me, I don't like those template things. I don't want to put my ideas in boxes. And my response is, don't put your ideas in boxes then. It's not about the boxes. Backward design at its heart is a way of thinking, a way of prioritizing and focusing the curriculum and teaching, and making sure that both our instructional techniques and strategies are aligned with our goals, and especially our assessments really fit. So it's not about the template. Having said that, I'm a fan, again, because especially if people are learning to plan this way, the template is a good guide and an organizer. And ultimately it rubs off. It becomes a mental process, a way of thinking. The other benefit is when you have a consistent format for curriculum, for course design, for training, you have the capacity to share with people within your institution or across the world, because there are thousands of both K-12 and university folks using this format. And so the consistent format has benefits beyond individual use. So I'm a fan. So I'd like to take a few minutes to look at each of the 3 stages of backward design, albeit briefly. And I'm going to engage you in an exercise in the first and second of these stages. So I'll invite you to add into the chat box when we set up the little exercise. So let's look at stage 1. This is where we identify our goals, objectives, outcomes. We call them desired results. What do you want as a result of your teaching? What do you want for learners? So to make this hopefully interesting and engaging, I'd like to use the idea of driving or learning to drive as an illustrative example. And I'm going to ask you 3 questions about learning to drive. Some of you, I suspect, are parents and you're in that learn to drive phase with your teenagers. If so, this will be particularly resonant to you, and we have empathy for you. You'll get through it. So I'm going to ask you to think about 3 questions, and I'm going to ask you to record your responses to the second question in the chat box. Okay? So imagine we're teaching a young person to drive, or we're a driver's ed instructor. The first question has been on the screen. What are some things that a beginning driver will need to know? And what are some of the many skills they'll have to practice before we're ready to even provisionally get them behind the wheel? You don't have to write this down, but just do a mental list. And you don't have to be exhaustive, but just a few examples of knowledge and skills needed by a beginning driver. Okay, I have a little teacher Apple Bell that a student gave me some years ago, and it still works. All right, so you probably have a few ideas in mind. Let's go to question 2. Now for this one, I'd like to ask you to enter thoughts. These can be short little bullet points in the chat box, but let me set this up. Here's my second question. Beyond basic knowledge and skills necessary for driving, what do we want a beginning driver to come to understand about driving? A way of thinking about this is, what does an experienced and an excellent driver understand that typically a novice or a beginner doesn't yet understand? And part of driver's training is developing the understanding that you hope they will really come to and be able to apply. And I want to distinguish knowledge from understanding, at least in a broad way. Knowledge would be something like, I know the rules of the road in Ohio, or I know the meaning of traffic signs and symbols. But understanding is more than just a fact, and it's more than a skill. It's not just a skill. So let me stop talking and let you enter some thoughts into the chat box. And check the screen, wonderful comments coming in. Wow, what a great list. All right, you can keep adding, and if you've already added yours, just scroll down, up and down, and you can see the many comments. Quite a number are the same or similar. Go slow, hit slow from boating. Good to remember when parking. Love it. All right, so you can keep adding if you wish, but let me wrap the exercise up with the third question. Oops, what happened? Oh yeah, here's the third question. You don't have to enter in the chat box, but you're invited to if you wish. But here's the third question. Let's step back from the day-to-day and ask the question, what is the ultimate goal of an effective driver's education program? In fact, more broadly, what is a societal goal for teaching and licensing drivers? Because think about it, what we're doing is we're giving a license to drive, essentially a lethal weapon, to a young person whose prefrontal cortex has not fully matured. And yet, we do this. So what is our ultimate goal in teaching and licensing drivers? And I'm thinking again, from a societal point of view. Now, I made that point to distinguish it from the goal of the teenager who's in driver's ed or training. What does the teenager want? What's their goal? Well, typically, pass the driving test, get that license, get the keys from mom and dad, get your freedom, be able to hang with your friends. That's a short-term goal. It's not the societal goal. So I like to pose this question and remind us of the larger purpose. So give some thought and enter some statements, as many of you are doing already, to this one. Oh, a great set of comments and statements coming in also. All right, I'm going to ring the bell, but keep adding as if you're in the middle of typing. So thanks for playing along with the exercise. I hope it was interesting, but I want to use it now to illustrate the three goal types and the elements in understanding by design in stage one. So this is our template in stage one. And one part of it has to do with acquisition, i.e., what knowledge and skills should the student acquire, in this case, as part of learning to drive. And I just put a few examples on the screen here, and you could certainly add more, especially in the skills category. But we want students to know driving rules and regulation, meaning of signs and symbols. They should know the basic car functions. You know, what does that button do? What happens if I pull this lever? Another one, what to do in case of an accident. That's an important thing that a beginner should know. And then on the skill side, there's a long list of skills that drivers need to practice, including the basic idea that before you even start the vehicle, you should make sure that the seat is properly adjusted and the mirrors are proper for your height. And then all the other skills that we practice in driver's ed. So for driving, there's a clear set of knowledge and skill outcomes, behavioral objectives, we might say, as there are for almost anything that we teach. But let's go to my second question, and you have many, many wonderful examples. We actually specify or recommend in understanding by design that you specify desired understandings beyond the knowledge and skill objectives. And so here are a few, and they're very parallel. The ones that Grant Wiggins and I came up with some years ago, very parallel to the ones that you can find in the chat box. In no particular, well, I'll go in the order on the screen. We want the student driver to understand that they are driving a potentially lethal weapon. This is a real responsibility, as many of you noted, and it demands constant attention and being careful. A second big idea that many of you noted, defensive driving. One person, I think, wrote, and I love this, don't assume that everyone else follows the rules. Defensive driving is a big idea, and it's something that the beginner may not think about. Hey, I'm careful and I'm paying attention and I practiced. Yeah, but you're sharing the road with idiots who do dangerous and unexpected things. That's something you have to come to understand and recognize how to deal with it. Being constantly attentive, not assuming that person is going to stop at the red light if they're going 70 miles an hour preceding it. A third big idea, something that's important to understand that many of you noted, that an effective driver is constantly adapting to various road, weather, traffic conditions. One size fits all driving can be dangerous. One of the comments I saw was black ice is invisible. That's a great example. This is something that develops over time with a driver. They come to these understandings. It's not immediate and it's not something that they can get just because we say, drive defensively. It's something that has to be developed. A fourth one that several of you noted, car maintenance. If you don't take care of your car, it won't take care of you, right? Young people, particularly those who are expected to pay for their upkeep of their car if they have one, often resist taking it for the annual checkup until the brakes fail. So these are examples of conceptual understandings. They're more than facts, they're different than skills, and yet they're, I would say, vital to our goals. One of the aspects of understanding by design is evident next to the understandings on our template. We propose framing our teaching through or by what we've called essential questions. The essential questions are linked to the understandings. I like to think of them as two sides of a coin. If a declared understanding is what you want students to come to, the essential question or questions are vehicles, pun intended, means to help them come to those understandings. So here are a few examples for driving. What does it mean to be a responsible driver? What does it mean to be a defensive driver? What is that and how do we do it? How and when should I adapt my driving? How should I care for my car? I propose you could teach an entire driver's ed course around 3, 4 of these kinds of questions. Obviously, there are more detailed questions tied to knowledge and skills, but these are the broader ones. We call them essential. They're essential to help us make meaning and come to understand important things that we've targeted. Now, the last question I asked you, and there are wonderful comments in the chat that you can view, get at what Grant and I call our transfer goals. We like to cast these as long-term goals. And in K-12 education, I'm actually argued that we're not talking about a transfer goal for every year, every grade, every course. We're talking about a transfer goal or a set of them at the end. And I would say the same thing goes. You could have a transfer goal for a unit or a module, but I'm actually arguing it would be minimally for a course and ideally for an entire program. So I'm arguing for long-term goals. They're admittedly broad in scope, but they are the end toward or from which we plan backward. The notion of keeping the end in mind is embodied when we have clear, agreeable, long-term goals that involve transfer. There are many good statements in the chat. Here are 2 ways in which Grant and I cast these, but there's no single way. It's up to the group, the team, the individual, or the organization to cast these. Notice our prefacing statement in italics as a question. What do we want students to be able to do on their own with their learning? Independent transfer is what we're after. So we want drivers who drive responsibly, safely, and courteously. I think several of you mentioned that. And we want to create drivers who are adaptable, able to drive in different road, weather, traffic conditions in different vehicles. So this is our framework in stage 1. This is how we cast our goals. Now, last point I want to make in stage 1. You might say, okay, I see these categories, I see what you're doing, but if you're in K-12 education, we've got state standards or national standards that we've got to address. Or if you're in a university course, or especially a certification type program, we've got industry standards. So where do they go? What, you know, are you ignoring them? Well, absolutely not. We really believe this is a standards-based framework. And in our layout, we put the standards, or we call them established goals, on the left side of the template. And in fact, in planning this example, Grant Wiggins and I went to the American Driver Traffic Safety Association, the group that has essentially national standards for drivers or drive training for drivers. And we derived our goals from those standards. Let me go back. So this is truly a standards-based framework if you're working off of established goals or standards. But what we have found necessary is very often to unpack the standards. Now, often if the standards are in detail, they're already going to specify knowledge and skills. But not all standards are overt or explicit about desired understandings. And we found that if they're not, we need to make them such. We need to unpack them and cast them very explicitly. And transfer, interestingly, in my experience, you may not find in long lists of standards, but you can often and almost always find them in the opening pages of standards documents. The opening pages of standards documents will give you the reason we're teaching all this stuff. What are our long-term aims? Why should students learn this? And that's where the transfer goals are often cast. So this is a generic form that we use in stage 1 with the questions that we ask people to consider when they're planning, designing their curriculum, building their courses, working out their training program. The 3 interrelated goal types, acquisition of knowledge and skills, understanding, and transfer, are reflected. So that's stage 1 of backward design. I hope it makes sense. There's a lot more to say about this, but I wanted to give you the example through driving. Now, permit me to share just a few more examples of essential questions, because I contend that these can be useful for any teaching learning situation, and they're especially useful for focusing our attention. Because without priority and focus, we can easily succumb to the problems suggested in the graphic here. Because in virtually anything that we teach, there's more content than we have time to teach. And so we have to have a prioritizing frame to make the best use of time and to make learning optimal. And my contention is thinking about long-term transfer goals, the important things that students will need to understand the transfer, and then the knowledge and skill foundations is a way of prioritizing and focusing the content. If our goal is safe, courteous, defensive, and adaptable drivers, students don't need to know all the car parts. If, however, the course is auto mechanics, then the knowledge depicted on the graphic rises significantly in prominence and importance. So again, I think that one of the great challenges of teaching today, and has been for some time, is that there's typically too much content and not enough time. And so we could talk faster in class and cover more, but that's likely to result in superficial, disconnected learning. We're saying that we should prioritize and frame our teaching around a smaller number of those bigger ideas, always preparing students for understanding and transfer, using the basics as the foundation. For those of you in K-12 education, you are no doubt familiar with Bob Marzano's finding about the most important factor influencing learning achievement at the school and district level is a guaranteed and viable curriculum. And Marzano used the word viable very deliberately. He said, we have to have a mechanism for avoiding what we refer to as curriculum overload. And the best thinking that Grant Wiggins and I have brought to the table is we need to focus and prioritize our curriculum. So in a nutshell, as you can see from the example, I hope, we're going to focus the curriculum around larger ideas and transfer goals and teach knowledge and skills in the context of preparing students for those, as opposed to trying to cover lots of discrete information. And secondly, and this is what I'll highlight for a moment, we frame the content of the curriculum or the course or the training through a small number of essential questions that are meant to engage students in thinking and always keeping the end in mind. Now, because I work in K-12 education, let me show you a few examples from discipline areas, but the process applies, I think, for almost anything one would teach. So here's an interesting notion. If the content you're teaching represents answers, what were the questions that led to those answers in the first place? This is a way of kind of framing the content through questions. And this isn't new. Socrates, among others, have done this over the years. But let me show you just a few examples from discipline areas. In English language arts, here are such questions. By the way, that third question is resonant with me. This morning, I was just skimming through the paper, saw one article, kind of skimmed it. But last night, I had to read a contract. And you can bet I read every single line. I've learned you better do that for the contract. For history, these are important and interesting questions. Whose story is it? One of the big ideas in history is his story, but it's also her story. To understand the past, we should deliberately try to hear different voices, different perspectives. And recognizing that historical interpretation is just that, it's an interpretation. And different historians can look at the same events and come up with different interpretations. So we need to understand that and not assume that's just because it's in a history textbook or we heard it in a lecture, that it's complete, true, unbiased. Every discipline has such questions. Many of these questions can in fact cut across disciplines, such as the third one in this list. We can also apply essential questions to these broader processes like effective communication, cooperation and teamwork, critical thinking, design thinking. Here are just a few examples. So that's a long way of saying, we recommend in Understanding by Design that for whatever you're teaching, even basic skills can be cast through essential questions. The essential questions help us prioritize and keep our focus, and their intent is to make students think and engage them intellectually. Coming to understand is a process. Making meaning occurs over time, and the questions become a route toward that end. By the way, I want to comment on Steve's good point in the chat box. Another point about history, it's often told by the winners. And by the way, that's one of the essential questions that I like to use. For any historical period or event, who are the winners and who are the losers in the Industrial Revolution or in today's global economy? Anyway, great one, Steve. For those of you who are curriculum geeks, I have an entire book Grant and I wrote on the whole topic of essential question. All right, so in my remaining time, let me share a few ideas with you in stages 2 and 3. And I have one more exercise I'd like to engage you with. So as noted, stage 2 is where we think like assessors. Here's one of my favorite cartoons, and it's 3 parts. And this is something, of course, we know. Yeah, I taught that. But the question is, what did the students get from my teaching? Sure, I covered that. But do they understand it? What's the evidence? This is what we are asking people to do in stage 2 of backward design. Here's our mantra. In stage 2, think like an assessor before you think like a teacher. Don't jump to, what am I going to do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or in class 1, 2, 3, or what chapters of the textbook will I ask students to read? Before you do that, given your goals, think like an assessor. What evidence do we need? So a couple of thoughts on assessment and then a brief exercise. I'm an amateur photographer, and I've always liked this analogy, that when you think about assessment, think of assessment as a photo album rather than just a snapshot. Because if you think about it, any single assessment, be it a test, a quiz, a skill check, a performance task or project, an observation, or a standardized test that comes from the outside, any and all of these could be thought of as a picture, a photograph, in that they give a moment in time, a picture of what students know, understand, and can do. But any single picture is likely to be incomplete, and it may even be a misrepresentation, such as if you're ever at a gathering, or used to be at a gathering, and someone takes a candid picture and your expression is not the best, or your hair is off, and you say, "No, please delete that." Get a better picture. But assessment is essentially an inferential process, right? We ask students to do something, and we make inferences from what they do as to what they know and how much they understand and their skill proficiency. And so our inferences are always enhanced. Our judgments are improved when we have more sources of evidence rather than less. So this is a fundamental psychometric principle, I'd say. Now, related point, we know we have a variety of different types and forms of assessment from which we can gather evidence of learning. We have traditional tests and quizzes and exams. We give kids writing prompts. Some of you use Blue Books, perhaps, or the electronic equivalent. We also have more performance-based assessments where students are applying their learning through a performance task or maybe engaged in a long-term project. We also informal ongoing checks for understanding, like thumbs up, thumbs down, or an exit card, or make a visual representation or a concept map of what you're understanding. And we can also think about students contributing evidence when they self-assess, when they reflect. So these are all forms of assessment evidence. This is one of my favorite cartoons that makes a humorous but also serious point. There's no one best type of assessment, I don't believe. There's a place for multiple choice or paper and pencil tests. They're efficient, effective, objective, and we use them, but we recognize they're not for everything. For some things we teach, the most appropriate assessment is performance-based, where students will actually apply their learning or demonstrate their skill proficiency. And I think because we have different goal types, it's likely that we're going to have different kinds of photos in our assessment photo album. The most important thing in backward design, and this really gets at the logic, is you should be matching your evidence with your goals. You should be gathering appropriate sources of evidence that permit or enable sound inferences to be made. And because we have different goal types, we need different kinds of evidence to see if kids are achieving these various goal types. Here's my cartoon that makes a serious point. We want to make sure that we're matching our assessments with our goals. or vice versa. Our assessments are giving us appropriate evidence to be able to judge the attainment of our goals. And I have to be honest with you, what I see a lot in K-12 education, and I can't speak more generally beyond that, is that in some cases, what we see are assessments that reflect what's easiest to test and grade, as opposed to appropriate assessment of all of our goal types. So I'll just put that out there. That's what I've seen. So because this is understanding by design, we've got to confront the problem or the question. So what is understanding? What are we going to look for as evidence if understanding is one of our goals? Well, my curriculum professor many years ago said, don't even mess with this. It's too messy. Don't frame your learning objectives as understandings. But I disagree. Grant and I don't believe that's correct, but we still have to confront this question. So we propose a judicial analogy. We're going to presume that students are innocent of understanding until convicted. But the question remains, what will convict them? Not just any evidence will do. I mean, rhetorically, would you be willing to convict a student of deep understanding if they could get 85% correct on a test of facts in a multiple choice format? Would you convict a student of deep understanding if they could perform an isolated skill effectively? My answer is not necessarily. So this raises the question, what is understanding? And I'd like to engage you at least briefly in the second exercise. And this to me is a fun one, so I hope you'll play along. Use the chat box. So what is understanding? What do we look for as indicators of it? As a teacher, what do you look for to see that a student really gets it? And what's the difference between someone who understands something deeply and someone who may just have superficial knowledge? So that's what I'm asking you to consider. Now, when I have more time and I'm doing in-person kind of workshops, we actually use a T-chart to play out this process. And we ask people to think about something specific that they want someone to understand, and then to identify the indicators on the left side, someone who really gets it, contrasted with someone who may know some things but doesn't really understand. Since our time is limited and we're not together, I'm going to ask you just to think of the left side. So what do you look for to see that someone understands? Or you can think about it for yourself. What's something that you yourself understand? And then the question is, how do you show it? How would others know you understand? What are the indicators of understanding is my question for you. I'm going to skip the math example and just go right to the T-chart. So let me ask you to do what most of you are starting to do anyway. What is understanding? Put one or more indicators in the chat, if you will, and look at other responses. What a great list emerging. James or Chuck, if you could capture the chat and send it to me, maybe post it. It's a great summary.
Absolutely. We have the technology.
All right. And it's working. I love the comments, and just being mindful of our schedule, I'm going to press ahead here. and share with you the most common responses that I get when I do this exercise with groups. And that's why I want the chat box, because it confirms. Here's, in a nutshell or summary, the kinds of responses that I typically get in this workshop, signaled by these verbs. And they are throughout the chat, by the way, I'm noticing. Just to highlight a few of these from the screen. Someone who understands can apply their learning, especially to something new. That's also known as transfer. Many of you highlighted that. Someone who understands can see or make connections between and among things, as opposed to someone who has rote learning. They may be able to remember a fact, but they don't know what it means or how it connects. Someone who understands, as many of you noted, can create something new. They can go beyond the information given. Someone who understands can explain it in their own words or their own way, or, as many of you noted, they can teach someone else. That's a great indicator of understanding if you do it well. Someone who understands can interpret. To interpret means to make sense of or to make meaning from. And we ask students to demonstrate their understanding by interpreting text. What's the main idea and what's between the lines? Or interpreting data. What, if any, pattern do we see in the data? Someone who understands can justify, not just give an answer, but support it, justify it, cite evidence for their response. Someone who understands, I'll go to the end, can troubleshoot. Several of you had that. A great check for understanding gives students a flawed example, a common misconception, or a skill error. Just present it to them and see if A, they can determine there's something wrong, and even better, can they correct it? That's a great check for understanding. It's the kinds of things that are listed on the left side and in the chat box that reflect indicators of understanding, and thus we can use them as a way of building our assessments. Whereas someone who only has superficial knowledge or has learned in a mechanical rote way may be able to do the things on the right, but they're less able to do that on the left. So permit me to do a quick categorization here. Here's my experience, folks. In a nutshell, when understanding and transfer are among our goals, our assessments need to have students do two things at least. Some application, where they're using the knowledge to something that's somewhat new. It's not just rote or recall or mechanistic, but they also have to explain it, show their work, explain their reasoning, justify their response, support their argument. It's the twin processes of application and explanation that we believe are necessary to convict students of understanding if they do these well. We have a more detailed theory that we've described called facets of understanding. And any of you in the chat afterward, the Q&A session, I'll be happy to elaborate. But I highlighted what for me are the most practical and applicable across fields that I think are prominent: application and explanation. I'm going to skip this one just for our schedule. But I do want to highlight, in stage 2 of backward design, our planning template basically has 2 categories. It's fairly broad. One category refers to performance assessments, because what is a performance assessment? A good one, but one that asks students to apply their learning to some situation or context and explain it. In other words, we think that evidence of understanding is best assessed through performance type assessments. I'm not going to maintain that there's no way that multiple choice can't assess understanding. I think that format can to some degree, but without the ability to explain or know why a student chose a selected response, you can't be 100% sure whether it was for deep understanding, superficial recognition, lucky guessing, or savvy test taking. So I'm going to maintain, in general, performance assessments give us evidence of understanding and transfer. And then we use supplementary evidence, including traditional tests, quizzes, and skill checks, to get evidence for some of our other goals, particularly the acquisition goals. I'm going to skip the okay. For those of you interested in another shameless plug, another book that's recently produced goes into some detail about designing authentic tests and projects, both as rich learning experiences as well as sources of assessment evidence. All right, in my final few minutes, let me at least touch on some ideas in stage 3. Stage 3 is where instructional design, i.e. planning our lessons and how we're going to teach and what are the learning experiences for students, resides. Day-to-day teacher planning or lesson by lesson planning occurs in stage 3. And once again, backward design says we need to be mindful of our goals to determine teaching and learning experiences. The goals drive everything in backward design, as they should. So I'm going to highlight just a few points before we wrap up. One of my contentions is that understanding must be earned. It must be earned by the learner. I don't think you can just give a student an understanding by telling them. Drive defensively. Correlation does not ensure causality. Just saying those things doesn't mean a student will really comprehend and be able to act on that. Understanding occurs over time and requires active meaning making by the learner. So this implies that our teaching and learning plan needs to include some active meaning making opportunities. Here's an illustrative example through a cartoon. Since I'm not with you, I had to throw in a laugh track. Now, some of you are laughing at this and others may not be. And that's a question. What is the difference? Oops, I gotta go. I'm gonna skip this one. Just because our time is short, let me wrap this up. It's my contention and the contention of cognitive psychologists and increasingly neuroscientists that meaning making is an active process where the student is thinking, questioning, listening to different points of view, and linking new information with prior knowledge to make sense of things. Meaning making is an active process, and the teacher's role is not simply didactic. It is more facilitative, Socratic, coaching, giving feedback, letting the student do the work because understanding must be earned. I'm going to wrap up with a quick analogy. See if this works for you. Think of a kaleidoscope. At the bits of colored glass that are in the scope already might be considered as examples of prior knowledge. New information would be new colored bits coming in. But those could come in and remain static or inert. It's the process of rotating the ring at the end, the active process of linking new information with prior knowledge that helps students see new connections, or the neuroscientists would say, build new neural networks that are making new connections and resulting in deeper learning. There's an awful lot more to say about this. And again, my final shameless plug is around another new book, which I think will be auctioned off later, Teaching for Deeper Learning, where my colleague and I, Harvey Silver, have talked about very specific ways of engaging students in active meaning making, leading to deeper learning, understanding, and transfer. For any of you interested in more information on understanding by design, my website, jmctighe.com, has a lot. Go over to resources and you'll find articles, videos, sample curriculum, resources for performance assessment. And I invite you to have a look and share it as you wish.